So let me begin with the significance of Imam Hussain. It's itself rare in human history. When a figure, like anyone else, is born in a particular society, in a particular city, in a particular family, that rises to a level beyond all accidents of birth, place of birth, language, ethnicity, and becomes a universal figure. Such is the figure of Imam Hussain. Putting the prophets aside, he's one of the very rare figures known from Beijing and Kuala Lumpur to Mauritania and the Atlantic coast and every land in between. His life, all of you know. Born in Medina, raised in the household of the Prophet, his mother, Fatima, being the daughter of the Prophet, and he being so beloved to the Prophet that the Prophet invented his name. The name Muhammad, Hassan, Abdullah, these are names that existed in Arabic already. The first person we know in history was called Hussein a.s. Hussein. And when the Prophet saw him, he said, "He's a little goodness, little beauty." And that's what Hussein, Babu Fa'il in Arabic means actually, from the word Husn, meaning both beauty and goodness. It's one of the most important words of the Arabic language, and other languages like Persian and Urdu and Turkish which use this term. But a moment came in his life when, having gone in patience through the caliphate of Muawiyah, when his older brother Hassan was Imam in the Shiite sense of the term, he no longer accepted the allegiance of Yazid. And you all know what happened. He set out from Karbala to Iraq, where the people of Iraq, of Kufa, invited him. But they reneged on their invitation, actually. But he knew he was going to his death already. And the most important thing that he left behind, writing word that he left behind, is famous Dua Arafah, which many of you have read, which he recited before setting out from Mecca to Karbala. And all you know, on the 10th of Muharram, he died on the battlefield outside of the city of Kufa, which is now the city of Karbala, one of the great cities of pilgrimage in the world. As you know, he was beheaded. And the head was taken by Zainab, his sister, to Damascus to Muawiyah. And Muawiyah, to Yazid. And Yazid was scared, and he said, "I didn't order his death," and had Shem put to death, the person who killed Imam Hussain put to death, and exiled Zainab. You know the famous sermon and the khutbah that she gave in front of Yazid, which was one of the great masterpieces of the Arabic language. And no time in Islamic history has a woman given such an eloquent khutbah. And so that scared Yazid, and he exiled her. She went to Egypt, and according to most historians, and the Persians don't want to accept it, his head was buried near the city of Fustat. And from this one head grew the biggest city in the Arab world. All of Cairo is built around the head of Sayyidina Hussein. Anyways, Hussein combined in himself an inner contemplative life and an outer active life. His brother Hassan, who was the first Imam of Shiism, was reversed. He had a contemplative life outward, lived a very quiet life, and the active life was within. It is he who spread really through his progeny Islam in all of North Africa. Almost all the Shurafa, the descendants of the Prophet in North Africa, are Hassani. Whereas there are some Hussainis, I'm not saying there's none, but most of the Sadat Shurafa in the eastern land of Islam, including my own family, are Hussainis. So it's not that Imam Hussain was doing nothing. We're disseminating the barakah of Islam in a kind of quiet, contemplative way, whereas the destiny of Hussein was something else. And it led to this unique event in the history of Islam. He was killed in an empire which was the biggest empire in the world at that time, spreading from China to Spain, run by the Umayyads. And this event in the middle of a desert, in the middle of that, what was then nowhere, finally brought the Umayyads down. All of the revolts against the Umayyads, from Mukhtar and to finally Abu Muslim al-Khurasani, who was instrumental in the destruction of the Umayyad dynasty and the bringing of the Abbasids, were related to the Qiyam of Hussein. So this is a very, very important, not only religious, but also historical event. It changed the history of Islam and many other countries ancillary and next to it. And therefore, Walaya is a living spiritual force and reality. It's not only of historical significance. And from this wonderful word comes so many different terms I will not get into. But only one term I will mention, which is mentioned in the Quran, Inna awliya Allah la khawfa alayhim wa hum la yahzanun. The awliya of God, that's the plural of wali. A wali is a friend of God. And Hussein and Hassan certainly were God's very close friends. He left behind, as I said, very few writings or sayings, but this few that he has left are very precious. Now, he remained a model and still remains a model for Muslims. And I want to just mention a few of the most important traits of Seyyed Hossein of Imam Hussain, which have served as models over the centuries and which are still very much alive. Because Hussein is not dead, he's alive. Although he would not be in this room. What are we doing here? So I want to mention for you some of the very, very important points. One of which is quite subtle. And for a general audience like this, it might be difficult, but nevertheless, I have to say. Christianity is based on the idea of sacrifice. Sacrifice is central to Christianity. The central rite of Christianity is the Eucharist, the Mass. And in the Mass, all serious Christians, Catholics and Orthodox, and some of the most traditional Protestants like the Anglicans, they're participating in the sacrifice of Christ. The bread is the flesh of Christ, the wine is the blood of Christ. So they participate in the flesh and blood of Christ. That's what the spiritual significance of the Mass is. Islam is not based on sacrifice. Islam is based on La ilaha illallah, the knowledge of the oneness of God. But the major elements of human existence cannot not exist in every religion. In the same way that in Christianity, all is based on sacrifice, the Catholic credo begins, credo in unum Deum, that is La ilaha illallah. I believe in the one God in Latin, which has been recited for 2,000 years in churches. In the same way in Islam, it's in Imam Hussain and the passion of Imam Hussain. This element of sacrifice comes to the fore. In a sense, Imam Hussain is the Christ within Islam, the Muhammadan world, the Islamic world. And we must remember that he represents the supreme sacrifice for Muslims and has been the supreme exemplar of sacrificing. Of course, when he died in Karbala, he was already gone. He had already transmitted the power of the Ummah and the Walaya to Zain al-Abidin. He was not in pain. He was already in another world. But from the human point of view, that of course represents the supreme sacrifice, to die for the truth. Then there's the question of freedom. Freedom is a word that is flung around a great deal today. Hurriya in Arabic, Azadi in Persian. But spiritual freedom is one thing, and freedom from God is something else. Today, it's freedom from God that we're after. Whereas traditional society was freedom from the nafs. And when Imam Hussain speaks about freedom, it's freedom from ourselves, from our lower selves. Not only dictators and political figures and so forth. He wasn't there just to be a political reformist. He was much more than that. He's a reformer of our souls. And the question of freedom that he speaks about is several very important things. He says we cannot do this and that, at least be free. This means actually freedom to be ourselves, and to be ourselves means to be Abdullah, to be the slave of God, to be the servant of God, to be truly in surrender, taslim, from which the word Islam comes, to God himself. And then there's the great virtue of truthfulness, which is the heart of Islam itself. Islam is based on the message of the truth in its absolute sense. La ilaha illallah is the absolute expression of the truth. And of course, all the Imams, and especially the Prophet himself, the whole life was exemplary as far as truthfulness was concerned. But Imam Hussain was especially marked to represent this virtue, even when he was a little boy. He was always truthful about everything. He lived in the truth. And his martyrdom, in a sense, brings back over and over again the importance of truthfulness. But the great lesson of Ashura is truthfulness. You must finally die before the truth. If you want to love God, you must be able to realize that nothing is before Him. Allahu ghaniyyun wa antum al-fuqara. What does it mean to be faqir? That means to have nothing. In the sense to die to one's ego, to one's self, to one's desires, to one's will all the time, wanting to do this and that. And he represents that, of course, at the highest level. And I want to add one other very, very important virtue, the virtue of chivalry, which has left our world so much, unfortunately. This in Persian is called Javan Mardi, and in Arabic, Fatawwa. And Ali was the founder of Fatawwa in Islam. He's the prophet who said to Ali, La fata illa Ali, la sayfi la dul faqar. There is no fata, there is no chivalry except that of Ali. The prophet bestowed this honor upon him. And here's the origin of chivalry. But when it comes to actual practice of everyday life, Hussein occupies a very important role, only matched by Father Ali, of being the supreme exemplar of chivalry, how to be chivalrous. Chivalry is a very, very important aspect of Islam, of Islamic spirituality, of Irfan, of Sufism, and it's very, very sad to see that our traditional culture, our adab, which derived from chivalry, has been so weakened, and especially among the younger generation of Muslims born in this country, where chivalry doesn't count for much. I'm not saying there's no one who's not chivalrous, although the word would not exist in English, but it's not central as it was in our own tradition. Finally, I want to mention the role of Hussein as intercessor. It's called shafa'a in Arabic, shafa'at in Persian. This is an enigmatic word debated a great deal among Muslim ulama, both jurists and theologians. There are certain Sunnis who do not believe that anyone except the Prophet can perform shafa'ah, and shafa'ah is already reserved with God Himself. They don't accept the intercession of saints. Of course, God is the forgiver. But one should keep a balance. One should keep a balance between correct action, which God expects of us, and shafa'ah or intercession based on God's mercy. Finally, I want to mention that the whole reality of Hussein contains a very important feminine element. It's extremely important for the understanding of female spirituality in Islam, and especially in this day and age, when we have all these problems. People give courses on women in religion. There are no courses in the United States on men in religion. We live in this day and age. It's very important to understand that what Zainab represents, her life is entwined with that of her brother. As I said, she's the most famous woman as far as historical action is concerned in early Islam, in fact, the whole of Islamic history. The two other women who came before her, who spiritually, of course, precede her, Khadija, the wife of the Prophet, and Fatima, her mother. But neither of them had activity in the world out there, you might say. Their activity was inward. Whereas that of course, Khadija protected the Prophet and so forth financially, but it was limited. But Zainab is a major political figure in Islamic history. At the same time, spiritual figure. And we do not have another example like that. And one cannot really think about Imam Hussein without Hazrat Zainab, without Zainab. And especially for women, the spirituality of Zainab is a very, very precious heritage that the Prophet, through his grandson, left for all the later generation of Muslim women. Now, having said all of these, this is about Imam Hussein himself. I want to say a few words about things that people don't really think about usually. And that is, first of all, the role of Seyyed Hossein on art, on Islamic art. Nobody thinks about this category. But it's very, very important. But first of all these beautiful madih, eulogies, poems about Hazrat Imam Hussein by Kalim Kashani, others, Sabit Tabrizi, Persian literature is full of it, and so is Urdu. I've heard a lot of Urdu poems about Imam Hussain in India and Pakistan, and also in Arabic. Some most beautiful poems in Arabic, written in Beirut, written in Damascus, written in Cairo, are about him, are about Seyyed Hossein. After that, the poetry and literature, you have certain arts which are specifically Shiite, which emanate from the event of the death of Hussein. They would not have been there had this event not taken place. One of them is we call Roza Khani. Roza in Arabic means garden. And Roza Khani has nothing to do with gardens. It has to do with a book by Va'iz Kashifi, a famous Shiite writer, which became sort of the Bible for what we call Roza Khani. Roza Khani is an event, I'm sure we have it now in Washington. Somebody gets up and talks about the tragedy of Karbala and how the various children were killed and so forth and so on, and people cry. It's a kind of catharsis, has a very important catharsis effect, but it can also be overdone. Finally, there's this very important art called the Tazia. Tazia is the only sacred theater in Islam. In Islam, because of the perspective, which is noetic, based on knowledge, La ilaha illallah, there was not this tension between the gods and men that is the origin of Greek play, Greek theater, Greek tragedy. Can you imagine there is not a word for tragedy in Arabic? There's not a word for tragedy in Persian. All the works translated from the Greeks. We don't have the word for tragedy. And the Greek tragedies were translated in the 19th century into Arabic. With all the translations that were made in the early centuries of philosophy, of theology, of mathematics, of social laws, everything, none of the tragedies were translated. Thucydides and Aristophanes and the great playwrights. This is alien to the Islamic perspective, but again, like what I said before, it had to manifest itself somewhere. And the two civilizations next to Islam, Hinduism and Christianity, sacred theater or play is very, very significant. Very significant. In Islam, the only place that we have it is in the Tazia. And the Tazia has produced some remarkable art. In the city of Lucknow, in Uttar Pradesh, in northern India, there's a place called Amambara, where they keep the paraphernalia of the Tazia. The horse of Hazrat Abbas is the size of this room. Everything in India is big, even cucumbers are this size. In India, everything grows big. You just cannot imagine what takes place. If you're ever in Lucknow during the month of Muharram, it's worth it, much better than seeing the best play in New York. I'm just from the point of art, theatrical art, but it's also combined with tremendous feeling and tragedy called the Tazia, the passion play, and we could not talk about Imam Hussain without talking about it. Okay, he is the central figure of the Tazia. The celebrations of Ashura, which have to do with Sayyid Hossein, have a tremendous cathartic effect upon also cleansing the psychological ambience and the social ambience of society as a whole. And they have been therefore used, but also misused many times. In the history of Islam, sometimes they've been misused to bring about frenzy and political machinations or events and actions and so forth and so on. I'm not going to go into that, but I want to express to you that something so macro, so big, that involves the whole of society cannot but have also a social and political dimension to it. It's the inner dimension. And also I want to leave with you the idea that the celebration, I would call it, not only the sad part, but the celebration really, not the commemoration, the celebration really of the martyrdom of Hussein is not limited to the Shiite world. It's not limited to Iran, Iraq, and Pakistan. It's also found very much in the Sunni world. And I want to recount a personal experience. In my young days, I was traveling in Morocco, and it was Tasu'a. And about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we're driving from Fez to Rabat. And that crosses right outside of the gates of the city of Meknes, which was the royal city and still had beautiful gates. And as that car was passing, I saw a large crowd standing over. I told my Moroccan friend driver, what's going on? Let's stop, see what's happening. So we went there, And there was a Moroccan about 22, 23 years old with what we call in Persian dotar, an instrument with only 2 strings. You have setar, and of course tar itself, which has 4 strings, and you have dotar, which is rare. Now we have only once in Kurdistan, but we have it also in Tehran a bit. Playing the dotar and singing in Arabic a song about Imam Hussain. And there were about 1,000 Moroccans who were crying. It's as if you were in Najaf or Qom. There was not a single Shiite there. Nobody had heard of Shiism. Because when I first went to Morocco, I was on Shiite. They said, "What is that?" It was like the ordinary people in the bazaar. Now, of course, they know. So Barakah of Imam Hussain goes beyond the borders of Shiism into the Sunni world, into popular piety in many, many Sunni countries, excluding, of course, Arabia. I'm not talking about places which are more or less heretical in their views of Islam. Just they're extremists. I don't care this and that in my life. If I don't go to Mecca again, I have to call a spade a spade. That is not Orthodox Islam. That is not traditional Islam. That is not the heritage of the Prophet, nor of our great sages, nor even of the Khulafa, Rashidin, the Khulafa of Sunnism. But there, of course, is an exception. But everywhere else, there's a presence of Seyyed Hossein. And so I want to conclude by saying, what is the significance of Imam Hussain today? Tragedy. Many of them would have a band around their head, Ya Hussein. The idea of this kind of outward jihad or sacrifice, of course, has always been there. Many movements have begun militarily, politically in his name. But his significance is much more than that. Its significance for us in a world of relativity, a world that relativizes everything, is that there is such a thing as the truth. And it's by the truth that we should live, and by the truth that we should die. And that by giving ourselves to the truth, we gain immortality in the positive sense of the term. We live in God's grace. And so this remarkable man, nobody can have his courage, nobody could be a warrior like him, of course. But the spiritual and moral characters of Imam Hussain, far from being something that just makes people busy during the Muharram and they make a little halwa or something like that and invite people to Roza Khani, it's much more than that. It to set a living example along with that of his father and grandfather for everyone of how to live upright, how to live virtuously, especially like a time like our own, in which there's so little truth around, so much falsehood abounds everywhere, in which everyone has become the slave of the immediate interests that they have, in which we have forgotten principles. It's good to live with principles. It's good to die for principles. Not everyone is asked to make the supreme sacrifice of Hussein physically. That's not possible, and God will not expect that of people. But all of us are expected to make it inwardly, to do so inwardly, to give ourselves for truth which transcends us, and finally saves us from the greatest enemy, which is not Yazid outside, but the nafs within ourselves. Thank you very much.